It was the kind of house that, from the street, looked ordinary, quiet, unremarkable, a place you'd pass without a second glance. But inside those walls, silence was no comfort. It was a silence broken only by the metallic stench of blood, soaked into carpet, sprayed across walls, clinging to every surface like a shadow that refused to leave. When officers stepped through the doorway on that winter afternoon in 1979, they did not stumble into a crime scene. They stumbled into something else entirely, something that felt closer to a nightmare than reality. On the living room floor, fragments of human remains. In the kitchen, utensils smeared with evidence of acts so unnatural that seasoned detectives turned pale. And in the center of it all, the invisible presence of the man responsible, a man who believed he could not live without drinking blood, a man whose hunger was never for food, but for life itself. This was not the work of a killer who acted out of greed, vengeance, or even rage. No, this was something darker, something that rattled the very definition of what it means to be human. The perpetrator of these crimes would earn a name that sounded less like a criminal and more like a legend whispered to frightened children: the Vampire of Sacramento. But who was he? How does a boy from an ordinary neighborhood in America transform into a figure so terrifying, so consumed by obsession that he would reduce his victims to nothing more than vessels? The trail does not begin with the bodies found in that house. It begins years earlier, in classrooms, in suburban bedrooms, in the mind of a child whose demons were invisible to those around him. To understand the making of Richard Trenton Chase, to comprehend the depth of the darkness that overtook him, we must go back, not to the crime scenes, but to the beginnings of the boy who would grow into a monster.
Richard Trenton Chase entered the world on May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara County, California. On paper, his early years looked ordinary, an American boy born in the optimism of post-war suburbia. Rows of pastel-painted homes, trimmed lawns, and white picket fences framed the backdrop of his childhood. Yet inside his family's house, that picture-perfect illusion began to fracture. Richard's parents, outwardly respectable, lived a life riddled with discord. His father was stern, demanding obedience without question. His mother, often withdrawn, struggled under the weight of her own inner battles. Arguments filled the household, leaving young Richard caught between two clashing forces, learning early that home was not a place of warmth, but of unease. Neighbors might have seen him as just another boy on a bicycle, another face in a schoolyard crowd. But small details hinted at something different, something unsettled. As he grew, Richard showed signs of withdrawal, a quiet detachment that separated him from other children. He struggled to connect, struggled to form bonds, as if some invisible barrier had already begun to isolate him from the rest of the world. Teachers noted he seemed distracted, drifting, as though reality itself often slipped from his grasp. Behind closed doors, his behavior turned stranger still. By adolescence, Richard exhibited the first chilling markers of what psychiatrists would later recognize as a deep psychological disturbance. He began to wet the bed well past the age most children outgrow it. He set small fires, fascinated by the flames, watching them dance as though they whispered secrets only he could hear. And he turned his cruelty toward animals, mutilating small creatures, testing the boundaries of pain and life. These were not just childish misbehaviors. To those who study criminal pathology, these patterns form what has come to be called the McDonald triad, a sinister constellation of behaviors often linked to future violence. Yet at the time, Richard's actions were brushed aside, dismissed as phases or quirks. Few imagined they were staring at red flags that would later grow into something monstrous. And in the midst of all this, there was the shadow of mental illness, a mind beginning to fracture under pressures invisible to the outside world. He reported strange sensations in his body, feeling that his organs were moving, shifting, even disappearing. He began to obsess over the idea that his blood was drying up, vanishing from within him. A young boy, lost in delusions no one could see, and ignored in a home too fractured to intervene. But no one could have predicted the chilling obsession young Richard would soon develop. By his teenage years, the strange patterns of Richard Chase's childhood had hardened into something far more disturbing. What began as quiet withdrawal soon became an obsession with the very substance that courses through every living creature, blood. Richard spoke of it, thought of it, fixated on it. He believed blood held power, that within its crimson flow was the answer to his growing paranoia that his own body was failing him. He feared his blood was disappearing, drying out, turning to dust. To him, life itself was leaking away, and the only way to restore it was to consume what others had in abundance. It started small, almost unnoticed, a fascination with wounds, a lingering gaze at the sight of a scrape or a cut. But curiosity shifted into compulsion. Soon, Richard began to kill neighborhood animals, rabbits, cats, even dogs, slaughtered not for sport, but for ritual. He dissected them, drained them, smeared their blood across his face and body as if coating himself in life would keep him whole. In his bedroom, his journals filled with strange notes and crude sketches of organs, vessels, and veins. He read medical books not to heal, but to study anatomy, searching for ways to understand and control the human body. Friends, what few he had, began to withdraw, unsettled by the smell of decay clinging to him, the rumors of dead animals, the vacant look in his eyes that suggested he was already somewhere else. To outsiders, these were whispers, odd behaviors that could be laughed off or ignored. But for those who watched closely, the danger was clear. The boy was unraveling, his mind drifting further into delusion. What he needed was help, intervention, treatment. What he received instead was indifference. And so the cycle continued, obsession feeding compulsion, compulsion feeding obsession. Richard's world narrowed to one truth in his own mind, that blood was not just necessary, it was survival. If you were Richard's neighbor and saw these signs, would you have reported him or dismissed it as just odd behavior? Because ignoring the warning signs would come at a price. But Richard's obsession would only escalate from animals to humans.
By his early 20s, Richard Chase's delusions had deepened into a labyrinth from which he could not escape. His appearance became gaunt, his skin pale, his eyes restless and hollow. He no longer seemed tethered to the world around him. Conversations drifted into incoherence. His thoughts spun into elaborate conspiracies. He was convinced his heart had stopped beating, that his stomach was rotting, that his blood was evaporating from within. What others dismissed as oddities in adolescence had now hardened into a psychiatric crisis. Doctors diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, a severe fracture of reality. Richard was admitted into a psychiatric institution, and for the first time, his obsessions were documented. But even behind locked doors, his hunger for blood did not relent. He found ways to catch small animals, stray cats, birds, and drank their blood,
convinced it was the only thing keeping him alive. And then, in one of his most disturbing experiments, he injected rabbit blood directly into his veins. Within hours, he collapsed in agony, his body rejecting the foreign substance, his skin breaking into violent rashes. The act nearly killed him, but for Richard, it was confirmation. Blood was salvation, no matter what the source. The medical staff quickly realized they were not dealing with a typical case. Chase's fixation on blood, his belief that his organs were failing, his compulsion to consume life from outside himself, it was a combination so rare, so grotesque, that it was etched in their notes with chilling clarity: blood fixation. And yet, despite these revelations, Richard was not considered permanently dangerous. Treatment stabilized him temporarily, medication dulled the edge of his delusions, and after a period of observation, doctors made a fateful decision. They released him into the custody of his parents, believing he could be managed in a familiar environment. But the delusions had not vanished. They had only been forced into silence, waiting for the right moment to roar back louder than before.
Doctors released them into the care of his parents, but Richard was far from cured.
Freedom did not heal Richard Chase. If anything, it unshackled the very impulses doctors had tried to contain. Once back in his parents' home, he quickly abandoned the medication that dulled his delusions. The voices of paranoia, the hallucinations of organs disappearing inside his body, returned with ferocity. Richard became convinced his blood was evaporating, that it was turning into powder inside his veins. He would hold oranges against his temples, believing the fruit could absorb nutrients and replenish what he had lost. He covered his face in blood, not out of disguise, but ritual, an attempt to keep death from claiming him. Neighbors began to notice. In the streets of Sacramento, he wandered aimlessly, his appearance deteriorating. His clothes were stained, his movements erratic. He began killing animals in broad daylight, tearing them apart, drinking their blood where anyone could see. People whispered, avoided him, crossed to the other side of the street. But still, no one stopped him. The smell of decay followed him everywhere. Visitors to his apartment recoiled at the sight of animal corpses littering the floor, their organs piled in containers, the refrigerator filled with remains. He blended their parts into drinks, mixing raw flesh with soda, blending blood into what he called slushies. This was not secrecy. This was obsession in the open, escalating beyond control. Paranoia deepened into ritual. Chase believed his bones were shifting, that his skull was cracking open, that if he did not feed on blood, he would wither and die. He was convinced he had no choice, that he was not a killer by desire, but a survivor by necessity. Yet beneath that delusion lurked a truth. Richard Chase's appetite was growing. Animals no longer sufficed. His body demanded more. His mind told him only one source could truly restore him: human blood. And soon, the Vampire of Sacramento would claim his first victim.
On the night of December 29, 1977, Sacramento was settling into the quiet of winter. Families gathered around televisions, streets emptied, and the city seemed still. But inside Richard Chase, the hunger had reached a breaking point. He was no longer content with animals. His delusions told him his survival demanded more. That night, he climbed into his mother's car, carrying a pistol, and set out into the dark. Driving through the suburban streets, he spotted a man unloading groceries. Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old engineer,
husband, and father. With no warning, no motive beyond compulsion, Richard raised the gun, fired, and sped away. Griffin collapsed, dying in front of his family before anyone understood what had happened. To police, it looked like a random drive-by shooting. To Richard, it was a beginning. Weeks later, the craving returned stronger than before. On January 23, 1978, he walked through the neighborhood until he found an unlocked door. To Chase, this was a sign. He believed locked doors were a signal he was not welcome, but unlocked doors were an invitation. That afternoon, he stepped through the open doorway of 22-year-old Teresa Wallen's home. Teresa was 3 months pregnant, spending a quiet day alone. She never had a chance to escape. Richard attacked with terrifying speed and brutality. The crime that followed defied understanding. Acts of mutilation, desecration, and drinking of blood. It was violence stripped of reason, driven only by delusion and obsession. The discovery of Teresa's body sent shockwaves through the Sacramento community. Newspapers called it unspeakable. Police, hardened by years of violent crime, described the scene in hushed voices. They had encountered murder before, but nothing like this. And Richard Chase was not finished. His hunger was insatiable, his delusions unrelenting. But it was the next crime that would shock California forever.
On January 27, 1978, Sacramento descended into a nightmare unlike anything the city had ever seen. Richard Chase, now completely lost to his delusions, prowled the streets searching for another open door. That afternoon, he found it, at the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Meredith. Inside the house were Evelyn, her 6-year-old son Jason, a family friend named Dan Meredith, and Evelyn's 22-month-old nephew David. The moment Chase stepped inside, chaos erupted. Dan Meredith tried to protect the family, but was shot dead almost instantly. Jason, terrified, tried to run, but Chase's rampage was merciless. Evelyn herself was assaulted and killed in a frenzy of violence that defied comprehension. What followed was so disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggled to describe it. Chase's fixation with blood and flesh had crossed into the realms of necrophilia and cannibalism. He desecrated Evelyn's body, leaving behind a crime scene that police later called one of the most horrifying in American history. When relatives arrived at the home later that day, what they discovered was beyond words. The scene was so grotesque that even hardened detectives would carry the memory for the rest of their lives. As the truth came to light, questions began to spread through the community, and even within the police force. Could this massacre have been prevented? After all, Chase's psychiatric records revealed years of escalating warnings, delusions, violent tendencies, and an obsession with blood. How had he been released into the world untreated? The media dubbed him the Vampire of Sacramento. The city lived in fear, doors locked tight, parents keeping their children close. But Richard Chase's reign of terror was nearing an end. Because soon, the Vampire of Sacramento wouldn't escape justice for long. As news of the Miroff family massacre spread, Sacramento erupted in fear. Parents refused to let their children play outside. Police patrols doubled. Every unlocked door now felt like an invitation to death. The investigation was relentless. Detectives pieced together fragments of testimony from neighbors and survivors of Chase's erratic encounters in the weeks before the murders. Witnesses recalled a gaunt man, sunken eyes, clothes soaked in stains that no one dared to question. A man who muttered about blood, who smelled of decay, who knocked on doors at random. Soon, the puzzle led straight to one place: Richard Chase's apartment. When officers forced their way inside, they were met with a stench that clung to their clothes long after they left. The small, cluttered unit was drenched in filth. Blood smeared the walls and kitchen counters. In the refrigerator, officers found containers filled with body parts. On the counter, a blender coated in red residue. Everywhere they looked, fragments of Chase's obsession were laid bare. And there he was, Richard Chase himself, disheveled, thin and drenched in blood, calm, almost detached, as though he had been waiting for them. The Vampire of Sacramento had finally been caught. For the first time in weeks, Sacramento could breathe again. But as Chase was led into custody, detectives and prosecutors knew the battle was far from over, because what happened in the courtroom was almost as disturbing as his crimes.
The trial of Richard Trenton Chase became one of the most chilling spectacles California had ever seen. The court was packed, reporters scribbling notes, families of victims staring with grief and fury, ordinary citizens drawn by morbid curiosity. Everyone wanted to look into the eyes of the man they called the Vampire of Sacramento. The defense painted Chase as a broken man, trapped in the torment of paranoid schizophrenia. They described his delusions, his unshakable belief that his blood was turning to powder, his desperate obsession with replenishing it through others. Their argument was simple. Richard Chase was not a monster, he was a patient who had been failed by the system. But the prosecution told a different story. They described him as cold, calculating, and fully aware of his choices. They displayed photographs of the crime scenes, retold the horrors inflicted upon innocent families, and demanded that justice must come in the harshest form possible, the death penalty. For weeks, the jury listened. They weighed testimony from psychiatrists, police, and neighbors. They studied Chase's expressionless face, his vacant stare, his muttered words that made no sense to anyone but himself. And finally, their decision came. Richard Chase was found guilty on 6 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence, death in California's gas chamber. But even as the gavel fell, a haunting question remained. Do you think Richard Chase should have been executed or committed to a psychiatric hospital for life?
1980, less than 2 years after his conviction, Richard Chase was found lifeless in his prison cell. He had hoarded and swallowed an overdose of antidepressant medication, bringing his own story to a final, quiet end. But his death did not erase the horror he left behind. To this day, criminologists, psychiatrists, and true crime experts still debate the lessons of his case. Was Richard Chase the product of untreated schizophrenia spiraling out of control? Or was he a man who chose violence and hid behind madness as an excuse? For the families of his victims, the answers will never undo the loss. For Sacramento, his name remains synonymous with terror. And for the rest of us, his story stands as a chilling reminder. When warning signs are ignored, the consequences can be unthinkable. Richard Chase's crimes force us to ask, how many other warning signs go ignored before tragedy strikes? Could this have been prevented? And if you want more stories like this, the journey doesn't end here. If you found this documentary chilling, subscribe for more true crime stories and tell me in the comments, should I cover another case like this or an unsolved mystery next?